AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson joining you here on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, as usual on Tuesdays, we're joined by Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Make sure you go to minnesotareformer.com for the best in Minnesota news and politics. Again, that's minnesotareformer.com. As this will be the first conversation we've had with Patrick since Election Day last week, so we have lots to talk about, including some voter data, when we look at who won what counties and how Amy Klobuchar significantly outperformed many DFLers on the ticket. Plus, we'll be talking about Republicans claiming they have a mandate in the State House of Representatives, even though we're down to a tie. Plus, we'll talk a little bit about Governor Tim Walz now returning to the state of Minnesota. So lots to get to today. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Always a pleasure.
So let's start off talking about Governor Tim Walz and your column titled Weird One. Now Governor Tim Walz comes back home. So I'm curious, you had a chance to speak to a number of political operatives. What were they saying about Walz's impact on the ticket? Did they think he largely helped or hurt the Harris campaign in Minnesota, or maybe even didn't really have much of an effect whatsoever?
Yeah, I think that the general thinking is that, as has always been historically the case, people don't vote for vice presidential candidates. That's not to say it doesn't matter at all. It's certainly a big decision on the part of the nominee to pick their running mate, and the person can have some impact on the margins, but overall, this is not Tim Walz's fault. That said, the knives are out whenever you lose an election, and there's always going to be people who are going to find fault with his performance, and especially when the tipping point state, that the state that really determined this election was Pennsylvania, and Governor Josh Shapiro was the other finalist to be Harris's running mate. And so there's some question about whether or not they would have won Pennsylvania with Shapiro. I'm still kind of pretty skeptical of that. I don't think that the fact that you come from a state really means much in a presidential race these days. It's not like it used to be. And there were certainly some missed opportunities in some media moments for Walz, and some cleanup the campaign had to do after his various misstatements about his own personal biography. But you also have to consider that he did draw a lot of energy to the ticket, and the overall impression that Americans had of Walz was positive. So, I mean, I think it's kind of a mixed bag. You lose, and you're certainly going to face second guessing and criticism. But historically, the vice presidential nominee has never been the cause of a candidate losing.
Yeah, and as we've seen oftentimes throughout history, sometimes when you have the losing vice presidential candidate on a ticket, they sometimes will even run for president during the next election cycle, or possibly even one after that, which brings me to my next point, which has to do with the future of Governor Tim Walz, because he, of course, is a two-term governor of Minnesota. But we don't have term limits in Minnesota. We just oftentimes haven't had governors that have sought a third term. So I'm curious what the speculation might be around his future, because A, would he possibly seek a third term for being governor? And then even looking beyond that, is he a potential presidential contender as we look ahead to 2028?
Yeah, he and the people around him had always acted as if he were seeking a third term, and I think that's something you do whether or not you're actually going to run or not, because you don't really want to be perceived as a lame duck. And it's important that people think, well, this guy might still be governor another 4 years, and so I better watch my P's and Q's. But like you said, we've had plenty of third-term governors, but Minnesota only went to 4-year terms starting in 1963, I think. So, or the 1960s in any case. So this would be a new thing to have 3-4-year terms. As you do the job presumably you get more comfortable with it, and it seems like a job that he enjoys. But on the other hand, he's now had that taste of the national political scene, and went through a grueling campaign. He may not be ready for another reelection. So I think we'll just have to see. I don't think that decisions have been made. He needs really to, I would say, rest and think through his future. And also remember, he's not a lifelong politico. He only ran for office for Congress the first time, 2006. He was already a well-established adult. And I think that certainly I talked to somebody close to him last week who said, he sometimes muses about running a hobby farm. And so I think we just don't know at this point.
Yeah, still very early on, being that we haven't even reached January of 2025, so still lots more time for him to decide what his future might be. But now, as we look at down ballot, let's talk a little bit about what happened at the state legislature, because I'll at least throw this in here. As we were chatting last week, you had a chance to speak to a number of operatives, and I believe it was pretty much a 50-50 split as to whether they thought the GOP or the DFL would control the House of Representatives. And, well, I guess technically none of them were right, as we ended in a 67-67 tie, which does, of course, break up the DFL trifecta that we held, where we had, of course, a DFL House and Senate, as well as a DFL governor. But now at least we have a tie in the House. Now, ties generally aren't something to celebrate, but Republicans are claiming a mandate, saying that we have broken up the trifecta, and now because we have this tie, somehow Republicans have a mandate. So my question for you is, do we necessarily buy the idea that there is a Republican mandate? And really, how should the DFL and Governor Walz at large kind of respond to this idea that Republicans are claiming a mandate now to govern the state of Minnesota?
Well, what's interesting here, and we're running a piece, we just published a piece about ticket splitters. So these are folks who voted one way in the presidential and another way in the legislative races. And we do see some suburban districts where quite a number of folks voted for Kamala Harris, but then they voted for Republicans in their House race, or maybe they left the ballot blank. And so that's how you see these 4.3% margin in the presidential race. Amy Klobuchar ran 16 points ahead of her Republican opponent, whereas in the House, the aggregate House total was just 0.5% advantage to the DFL. So you really have to start wondering, why did people back Harris and Klobuchar, but not necessarily their DFL legislative candidate? And so I think there's probably some introspection that's required there on the part of Minnesota Democrats. Was their agenda in some suburban districts? Was it too much for those voters? And that's caused them to lose the House. That certainly seems like a possibility. Republicans don't have a mandate to govern. They don't control any lever of government. They do have this tie, and so they certainly have a lot of leverage, which is going to be concerning for Democrats going into next year because it's a budget year. So Republicans are going to certainly try to cram down spending and probably go for tax cuts depending on the size of the surplus. And the problem is that Democrats, who are the ones who are generally believe in government and the things that it does, they need to keep the lights on. And if the legislature can't come to a deal on a 2-year budget by June 30th of next year, then government starts to shut down. So it's certainly it's a big loss, and they've lost a lot of power that they had the last 2 years, and it's going to require an adjustment in thinking.
Well, my next question comes down to this: when we have an evenly divided 67-67 House, who becomes the Speaker? Because I know this is the first time in Minnesota history where we've had an evenly divided House. I believe the last time was back in the late 70s, when I think it's safe to say we weren't quite in the same partisan type times back then that we were or that we were then, that we are as compared to where we are right now. But how are they going to determine who becomes the Speaker of the House when it's evenly divided? Because I can't imagine many, if any, DFLers are going to vote for a Republican speaker, and vice versa, probably the same for the Republicans as well, thinking, well, there's no way we're going to vote for a DFL speaker. Have there been any conversations when it comes to determining who's going to be that speakership and who's really going to set the agenda for that evenly divided House?
We were told, I think, this week that they have not begun negotiating in earnest, and that's what's going to be required. They're going to have to decide who will be speaker, and then obviously, if you get the speaker's gavel, you're probably going to have to give away a lot in terms of committee chairs. So I suspect we'll have a mix that way, where let's say you had a DFL speaker and Melissa Hortman. And then you would have key committees like Ways and Means, which controls spending, and taxes would be Republican chairs, which means they get to control the agenda. Another key committee would be Rules. The Rules Committee determines what comes to the floor. So this is all going to have to be worked out. As you mentioned, 1979, there was a 67-67 split. It apparently ended in quite a bit of acrimony, which was significant for the time because it was just much less partisan rancor in those days than there is now. So it's certainly going to be an interesting situation and force the lawmakers to be adults. And so we'll see how that works.
Now, naturally, when we would look at the House of Representatives going from DFL control to now evenly split control, you would think that would possibly be something that would hurt Governor Tim Walz in the long term. But when you had a chance to speak to a Republican operative, I believe this was someone who used to work for the Pawlenty administration, they're saying that the split legislature, or at least having a 50-50 legislature, could end up benefiting Walz by potentially having a foil. I'm interested in this angle because on the surface you would think, well, that's probably not going to help Walz and his agenda, but does that potentially help him in the future for having that foil and someone to play off of over the next couple of years?
Yeah, because he remains the guy with the biggest megaphone. He's near 100% name recognition. And so if you see the evenly divided House, especially the House Republicans, if they are deteriorate into trying to shut down the government over their tax cut demands, he'll be able to really frame that debate pretty well next legislative session. And, I mean, if you look at history, in 1994, 2010, you had Democratic presidents whose party suffered bad defeats in midterms. They lost their legislative chambers, and then they wound up getting reelected 2 years later. So it's not uncommon for an executive to succeed with a mixed legislature, and of course Walz has already done it. He had a divided legislature during his first term, and of course came out with a fairly easy reelection victory in 22.
And one more piece of information I wanted to talk about with you today, and that has to do with Christopher Ingram's top line, as he, of course, is a data reporter for the Minnesota Reformer and was able to look at some election data. And just want to go through at least a couple pieces of data that caught my eye, and feel free to do the same yourselves. But one thing he brought up that kind of caught my attention was the fact that, at least nationally, Donald Trump was able to significantly cut his margins in many urban areas throughout the country, including New York City, Miami, and others. But what I found interesting was that this largely didn't happen so much in the Twin Cities, where I believe Trump only outperformed its previous margin in Hennepin County by 1 percentage point, while in Ramsey County, which includes St. Paul, he only outperformed his previous margin by about 2 points. Any reason we can look at why perhaps the Harris-Walz campaign fared a little bit better in urban areas as compared to other parts of the country where Donald Trump was able to make some significant gains in these urban metro areas?
Yeah, I mean, it's all speculation, but I think the fact that the Twin Cities remained more affordable during the last 5 years, helped along by a real boom in building of housing, and that kept rents much lower than some of these other big cities where they have a shortage of housing, and you saw rent increases, really significant rent increases compared to where we are. I think there's also there's an issue in some of those cities of just poor governance and a fair amount of social disorder. Not to say we don't have that here, and there's certainly been a lot of coverage of that. But I think if you go to other cities, maybe it was more extreme, and so there was more of a backlash against Democrats who run those cities. And you saw this especially in New York City and the outer boroughs of New York City especially. So that really wasn't the issue here. Chris wrote another piece about how Democratic turnout in their stronghold cities was down really just enough to make a difference. And so that seemed to be like the bigger problem for Democrats here. And I think it's probably not something they expected, but something happened that there were some precincts here where they had really heavy turnout in 20, and people just did not feel motivated to get out in 24.
And looking at some other data that he was able to report on, at least a couple other things that caught my eye was the fact that about half of local school levies were able to pass on the ballot this year, as well as the fact that Amy Klobuchar was able to win about more than twice as many counties as Kamala Harris. Klobuchar won 21 counties, while Harris only took 9. Anything else catch your eye as we looked at some of the other election data throughout Minnesota before we wrap things up today?
Yeah, I mean the Klobuchar result. She had a strong, very easy election, but I think it's also worth noting that even though she did carry 21 of 87 counties, which in this day and age is a remarkable result, consider how that's different from 2012, when she carried 85 counties, and I think you get a sense for how we have become so regionally and geographically polarized. That really caught my eye.
Yeah, that's pretty striking to think about. 85 of 87. That is completely unheard of in today's politics. And wow, that was only 12 years ago when that happened. So even though she won pretty overwhelmingly, it does show, how that regional polarization has taken hold over the past decade or so. Well, we have been speaking with Patrick Coolican. He is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer. Make sure you catch him and the other great writers over at MinnesotaReformer.com for the best in Minnesota news and politics. Again, MinnesotaReformer.com, as they'll be following what happens coming up next year in the state legislature, which should be a very interesting time with that evenly divided House. Patrick, as always, thanks for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.
I don't know. Every time you turn around, she's always in your pocket. Always on your MONE.